Hello and welcome to another lecture in the Abra Linha ao Vivo series. Abra Linha ao Vivo is an initiative of the Brazilian Linguistics Association. I am Miguel Oliveira, president of Abra Linha. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce William Croft, professor emeritus at the University of New Mexico, Albuquerque. Bill Croft has taught at the University of Michigan, Manchester, and New Mexico, and given lectures all over the world. He is the author of dozens of articles and 9 books, including Typology and Universals, Radical Construction Grammar, and Explaining Language Change. The title of his lecture today is What's Typology Got to Do with Analyzing Your Language? Before we start, I'd like to thank Bill Croft for accepting Abra Linha's invitation and to say that questions and comments are very welcome in the chat. Please join me and welcome Professor William Croft.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Share the screen, share my screen. So as Miguel said, the topic of my talk today is what's typology got to do with analyzing your language? So typology studies the great diversity of languages, and functional typological linguists explain constraints on cross-linguistic diversity in terms of function, cognition, and social interaction. But it has been questioned what the role of typology is in the description or representation of individual languages. So for instance, Fritz Neumeyer, the generative linguist, wrote in his book, Possible and Probable Languages, no child is exposed to cross-linguistic generalizations. Since typological generalizations are not conceivably learned inductively by the child and are implausibly innate, one must conclude that they are not part of knowledge of language at all. So one could quibble with some of Fritz's details. In particular, it's not expected that typological generalizations are themselves represented as part of the knowledge of a single speaker. But instead, we can formulate this in a way that I think is more suitable. What would be the underlying explanatory factors that would account both for individual language patterns and cross-linguistic patterns, that is universals, in such a way that speakers of a single language would have access to them, and linguists analyzing a single language would want to refer to them? So that's the question I'll be looking at today. So starting, let's say, take a perspective here on single language analysis, about as neutral as I can do it. And so we'll be focusing on the notions of distribution and categorization. The distributional method is the fundamental method underlying single language analysis. And basically, it's illustrated with the sentences on the screen for a very simple contrast in English between words like cold and happy on the left and words like dance and sing on the right. So a word like cold occurs in a sentence like 1A, but not 1B. So Jack is cold is okay, but Jack cold is not. Likewise with happy. In contrast, it's the other way around with dance and sing. So dance is okay in 3B, Jack dances, but it's not okay at 3A, Jack is dance. So this is what's called a distributional analysis. We can present it in a tabular form. In a simple case, we have 2 sets of words. One set of words occurs in one construction with the B forms, and the other one does not. Instead, it occurs in the other construction with the tense and person marking inflections. So this is a super simple example of what's done in a much more rich and complicated way. So as I said, the distributional method analyzes occurrence of words or phrases in constructions. Now these constructions are often called other things in the syntactic literature, like tests, criteria, arguments, evidence, and so on. So the distributional method presupposes the existence and identifiability of constructions, of those constructions used for the distributional analysis. So we must actually identify and distinguish constructions first. So how is that done? Well, analyzing constructions in a single language is essentially categorization of utterances or parts of utterances in terms of shared properties of meaning and/or of form. That's not quite precise, but we will come back to that perhaps in the discussion. But essentially, that's how we're going to consider it for now. In a construction grammar approach, categorization of utterances and their parts is usually represented as a network of grammatical constructions, although there are more sophisticated ways to represent similarities of function and form, and we will see some of those later in this talk. So let's look at a single language analysis, starting with expressions like "she is a doctor" on the lower right of the screen. That's called a predicate nominal construction in English, and it's basically a grouping of all sentences that have that structure: she is a doctor, I am a teacher, and so on. It can be compared to other sentences in English that can be also grouped together in their own way. Predicate adjectivals such as she is smart, they are tall, and intransitive verbal predications such as she dances and he sings. Many of these examples are from that earlier slide. So we do that low-level grouping. Then we can start grouping these constructions together as verbal predication versus non-verbal predication in English. So verbal predication has the tense, subject, agreement inflection. So that's the formal property that groups those sentences together. Non-verbal predication groups the sentences together by using the copula be without the inflection on the adjective or nominal. In addition, predicate nominals, at least in the singular form, use the article a. And then we can group these to a more abstract construction and predication construction consisting of a subject phrase combined with a predicate phrase in English. So that's a kind of formal analysis of constructions in a single language. There's also the function side, and we can't forget that. So predicate nominals predicate an object category, predicate adjectivals predicate a property, verbal predications predicate an action, and those can all be grouped together as predicating a referent. So that's an extremely quick summary of single language analysis in as neutral a fashion as we can present it. Now I want to look at comparative analysis, cross-linguistic analysis as done in typology. So these are called comparative concepts now. And why do we need these? Well, when we look at different languages simultaneously, we always get hung up on definitional issues. So does the language X have adjectives or not? Does language X have a passive? So to resolve these issues, we need some kind of basis for cross-linguistic comparison, as I described in my typology textbook years ago. More recently, Martin Hasselmann has coined the term comparative concepts to describe these, and that's provoked a lively debate in typology. Now, distributional analysis cannot provide a basis for cross-linguistic comparison because it's language particular. So for example, you're looking at the occurrence of Chinese forms and Chinese constructions. Now we'll see later this is a bit pessimistic, but let's just start from there. That's certainly the starting point of the typological approach. And I'll skip that second bullet point. But the last point is the important one, is if we don't use distributional analysis for cross-linguistic comparison, what kind of comparative concepts can provide this cross-linguistic basis? Well, from the earliest days of modern syntactic typology, going back to Greenberg's classic article in 1966 on word order universals, basically he came up with a solution that's been used for decades in typology, namely semantics. The quote says, "It is here assumed, among other things, that all languages have subject-predicate constructions, differentiated word classes, and genitive constructions, to mention but a few. I fully realized that in identifying such phenomena in languages of differing structure, one is basically employing semantic criteria. Another classic paper from a few years later, that Keenan and Comrie's research on relative clause accessibility, they write, we are attempting to determine the universal properties of relative clauses by comparing their syntactic form in a large number of languages. To do this, it is necessary to have a largely syntax-free of identifying relative clauses in an arbitrary language. Our solution to this problem is to use an essentially semantically based definition of relative clauses. So that's generally been the standard view for a long time. But we have had some developments in typology that represent innovations from this point of view. So the first is that semantics isn't always enough. So consider parts of speech, something I've worked on for my whole professional life, nouns, verbs, and adjectives from a cross-linguistic perspective. These have posed extremely vexing problems for cross-linguistic analysis. Most definitions of parts of speech are language particular, like distribution and morphological inflections and syntactic constructions in a particular language. But definitions based solely on semantics, like things, properties, and actions for nouns, adjectives, and verbs, don't work. Words like action and height, they refer to actions and properties, but they are nouns. So the solution that I proposed in my work is that parts of speech represent a combination of semantic content and what I'm going to more generically call information packaging. I call these propositional acts, and I'll be using that term in this specific case later on. So in this functional typological analysis of parts of speech, when we consider how these constructions and words behave across languages, we have to look not just at the semantic categories in red in rows on the left, object, property, and action, but we also have to look at these information packaging categories of reference, modification, and predication. So if you look at English, you'll see that the things that everybody will agree are nouns, adjectives, and verbs, with the use of the word thorns and reference in the upper left, the use of the word sharp as a modifier in the middle, and the use of the word scratched as a predicate in the lower right. These cells are highlighted in yellow. But it is in fact the case that you can use all of these semantic classes in different types of information packaging, and that's what are illustrated in all of these other constructions. So for example, object modification, you can use the genitive construction, the thorn's tip, or you can predicate it, as we've seen already, it's a thorn. And the same is true with all the other categories in the white cells. So when I first did that work, I was focused on parts of speech and argued that this split level analysis of function as semantics and information packaging contributes to the analysis of typological variation in form. Since then, as I've tried to take a broader perspective, in particular in writing a textbook that is coming out next year, cited on the slide, I argue that all linguistic meaning, that is the meanings of grammatical constructions, can be described as the information packaging, also in Herb Clark's model, what he calls formulation, the information packaging of semantic content, as described in the forthcoming textbook on morphosyntax constructions of the world's languages. For those of you who are interested in cognitive linguistics, information packaging is basically construal for communication. So I'm going to quickly illustrate this in a couple of other domains and parts of speech. First, I'm going to look at grammatical relations, such as subject, object, and oblique roles, and argue here, or at least present some evidence here that semantic categories like semantic roles, agent, theme, and location for the spray verb that we see in this table, that those have to be combined with information packaging, and much work by people like Talmage Vaughn and others show that core syntactic roles tend to be more topical and oblique less topical. So we're looking at a kind of topicality of reference, a ranking of topicality. And again, we can see what we think of as totally typical English subjects are when agents are performed in the subject role, like protesters sprayed green paint on the sidewalk. The theme is typical the role in the object role, so that'd be green paint in the same sentence. And then a less topical role like location will be an oblique phrase as in on the sidewalk in the lower right. But again, as with parts of speech, you can basically combine any of these semantic roles with any kind of topicality ranking, and that leads you to the various constructions that you see, alternations, passive voice, and so on. There's one that's not found in English, but arguably it's found in other languages that are mentioned in the slide. When we turn to another challenging thing to define across languages, subordination and coordination, and those subordinate and coordinate clause constructions cover the same semantic relations between events, temporal relations like anterior, posterior, overlap, causal relations like cause, and then purpose, apprehensional, and many others. But actually, all of these semantic relations between events can be expressed either by subordinate constructions, adverbial subordinate constructions, or coordinate constructions. So at the top, we can say, you washed the car before driving to the party, you washed the car and drove to the party. We can switch the sequence, the temporal sequence, and you drove to the party after washing the car, but we can still express that as a coordination. I've argued in a number of works, including radical construction grammar, that the adverbial subordination reflects a figure ground conceptualization of the relationship between the two events. This was proposed by Len Talmy and Tanya Reinhardt many years ago. And then coordination represents some kind of complex figure, some kind of composite figure, position that was argued for by Anya Wyzwicka many years ago. So these can be thought of as information packaging or construal of the relations between these two events. So these are just to illustrate that this two split level approach can apply more widely. Now those are all functional categories, so it's kind of like classical typology. But we also have comparative concepts that are formal, or at least partly formal. So Martin Hasselmatt in that 2010 paper I cited before argues that we also need comparative concepts that involve form as well as function. And I would argue that you have to have form along with function. These formal properties must be defined in a cross-linguistically valid fashion, so not in terms of language-specific distributional patterns. And there are two hybrid types that are useful in typology. They've actually been around since the beginning of modern syntactic typology with the names I'm going to give you. But in this new context, we can think of them as Hasselmatt-style form plus function comparative concepts. The contrast here is between constructions and strategies. So I'll illustrate this with two sentences actually taken from a paper on the Universal Dependencies Project in computational linguistics. English, Ivan is the best dancer, and the Russian translation, Ivan Luchi Tansor. So a construction simply is a categorization of all morphosyntactic forms across languages that express a single function, in this case, object predication, predication of an object concept. We've talked about this already. So both English and Russian are instances of this cross-linguistic comparative concept of object predication construction. Strategies is where we add in the formal bit. So here, English and Russian contrast. So English uses an inflected copula construction. I'm using this term, it's from this massive, wonderful typological survey of intransitive predication by Leon Stassen. So an inflected copula has to be defined in a particular way. So the fine print in the lower left of the slide gives you that definition of a cross-linguistically valid formal description, an overt morpheme coding predication combined with the expression of categories that are expressed also by action predication constructions in the language. So in the case of English, it's person, number, and tense. Russian also uses a strategy, a different one. It's zero copula and zero inflection. So the word tansor, which means dancer in Russian, there's no copula, so there's nothing corresponding to English B. And the word tansor is not inflected for person, tense, and number, or any of the other Russian verbal categories. So these are how we can describe doing cross-linguistic comparison by categorizing constructions within and across languages as constructions in the sense of anything expresses a function, or a strategy that also specifies how that construction or how that function is expressed. So the construction is what is expressed, the strategies are how they're expressed across languages. So now let's go back and look at single language analysis and cross-linguistic analysis. So this is just a replication of the slide that I showed you earlier, where we have looked at sentences in English and grouped them together and categorized the constructions they belong to. In particular, what that means is we're taking a sentence like "she is a doctor" in the lower right, and we're comparing it to other sentences in the same language. Sentences that have property concepts like "she is smart," sentences that predicate action concepts like "she dances." Now, if we want to look at "she is a doctor" from a cross-linguistic perspective, we do it somewhat differently, because now we're going to compare the English sentence with sentences in other languages. So English has a predicate nominal construction. "She is a doctor, I am a teacher," as we've seen. Now we can group them together, these English sentences, with sentences in other languages, which also use the same verbal copula strategy that I described earlier. So French predicate nominal constructions on the left, they do that. Kiowa, it's a Tanoan language spoken in the plains of the United States. Its predicate nominal construction also uses a copula. Then we can compare these constructions across languages that use the verbal copula strategy with languages that use different strategies for predicate nominals or object predication. So we have Burmese, which kind of looked like Russian. "He is a soldier." Burmese is spoken in Myanmar. It's a Tibeto-Burman language. Classical Nahuatl is a Uto-Aztecan language spoken formerly in the Aztec Empire. And there they use the verbal strategy, where they do inflect the word referring to woman with the usual verbal type inflections. So you can see we can look at a sentence in English, and we can analyze it within English, and we can also analyze it across languages. So we want to aim for a unified analysis. So we take our sentence, "She is a doctor." We see that in English it belongs to this construction, the English predicate nominal construction that we saw in the single language analysis slide. The construction has parts or roles. So the predicate nominal subject, the predicate nominal predicate, and the copula verb be. Then we can look at its function. So the function is, it's an object. We're categorizing it as another category of object. So that's why we've got object twice there for "she" and "a doctor." Information packaging, "she" is functioning to refer to someone, and predication is predicating this object category of that referent. Well, that's also used in cross-linguistic comparison, as we saw, but then we also have these hybrid comparative concepts. So we can also say that the English sentence is an instance of this cross-linguistic comparative concept of predicate nominals, also known as object predication constructions, across the world languages. And more specifically, that it represents the verbal copula strategy for object predication, which is also found in other languages. Now, when you're doing single language analysis, you're just looking at these top four roles: the description of the construction's form and its parts, and the semantics and information packaging, its function. If you're doing cross-linguistic analysis, you're going to use function as its basis, but you're also going to look at the formal, the cross-linguistically valid formal categories, the type of cross-linguistic construction, and the strategy. So as you've probably all noticed, the way we can unify these two analyses is by the overlap between single language analysis and cross-linguistic analysis, and that is the function of the construction in English and across languages. And we are going to now exploit that missing link to be able to unify the look at a single language analysis and cross-linguistic analysis. So that means we'll be looking at variation across and within languages. And I'm going to start with a very simple example. the classification of nouns according to their animacy of what they denote, and constructions that express singular and plural number. So if we look at a language like Guarani, the first language in the column there, Tupian language, South America, in Paraguay, you'll see that there's the first and second person pronouns have singular and plural forms, but third person pronouns and all nouns, no matter what semantic class they belong to, do not have a distinct singular and plural forms. So that's a difference of distribution in Guarani. Then we can compare it to a difference in distribution between Usan and Papuan language in the Papua New Guinea, where all the pronouns have singular and plural, distinct singular and plural forms, so they can be treated as distinct constructions. All the nouns do not, that's called transnumeral in the business. We go to Tiwi, you can see now plurality also is found with human nouns as well as pronouns, but not with non-human animates and inanimates. Korea, an Austroasiatic language, has a singular plural contrast all the way across except for inanimates, and then Cree, like English, has singular plural contrast across the board. So you can see that there are differences in the distributional patterns within each language, but then when we compare them across languages, then you see this pattern which has been called the animacy hierarchy or the empathy hierarchy, which represents the ranking of reference that you see on the left-hand side. First and second person pronouns, third pronouns, humans, animates, and inanimates. Now, how can we get away with this? I've just told you already that distributional patterns within languages are language particular. Well, luckily, we can use function to calibrate, so to speak, calibrate cross-linguistically the distribution patterns of individual languages. We're looking at the occurrence of forms and constructions. So we do that by comparing forms by the meanings they denote. So human, animate, inanimate, first, second person. And then they occur in constructions, the number constructions. Well, again, we compare those constructions by what they denote. One object versus more than one object. This allows us to look at language internal distributional variation and cross-linguistic distributional variation at once and observe underlying cross-linguistic patterns like the animacy or empathy hierarchy. So this is the distributional variation I just talked about. And I want to emphasize that the evidence that typologists have put forward for the animacy hierarchy, such as these number constructions, compares distributional variation within and across languages. And many universals are like that, including parts of speech. Again, my favorite area to work on, so I'll be using this for the next set of examples. So, as I said already, I've argued that parts of speech should be the functions that are relevant, or the reference, predication, and modification for information packaging combined with objects, properties, and action semantic classes of words. Well, those two parameters or dimensions are not independent of each other. There's certain combinations that are privileged. So reference to object, as I mentioned earlier, is your prototypical noun. Modification by a property concept, your prototypical adjective, and predication of actions is your prototypical verb. So, as I said, we can do cross-linguistic comparison of distributional patterns by calibrating them functionally. So this is how we do that for parts of speech. This is the conceptual space. It's essentially just names describing the functions of those cells on the table that I showed you earlier. Object reference, modification, predication, and so on. And then, as I said, I identified 3 different cells on this conceptual space as representing prototypes for noun, adjective, and verb. Now, what do I mean by prototype? This is very specific typological sense. It has to do with the cross-linguistic distribution of these language internal distribution patterns that I just described to you. So to simplify things, we're just going to look at the bottom 4 functions in this conceptual space in the next set of examples. So in English, if we look at properties and actions, modification and predication. We have big, it can inflect, so that's indicated by blue, it inflects for degree, like a bigger mousetrap. In predication, you have to add this extra word, the inflected copula that we talked about, so that's indicated in orange. In action, it's kind of the other way around. In modification, we have to add a morpheme, either a participial suffix like the sleeping girl, or a relative clause marker for the girl that I met. And those again are indicated in orange as additional morphemes. In predication, the action predicate can be inflected for person and number, as we mentioned, and tense, as you mentioned before, shrinks, and that's indicated by blue. So you can see this is a distributional pattern. We described this actually in one of the very first slides, at least for the property predication. So we can describe this in what is called semantic maps in typology. So we can say the English degree is found in a property modification, English copula B is found in property predication, English relativizer that or participle suffix ing is found in action modification, and the English inflectional tense person inflection S is found in action predication. So that's how we represent, what I mentioned before, other ways to describe distribution patterns or categories of constructions, other ways than a constructional taxonomy. Semantic map is one other way to do that. And it allows us to compare English now to another language, such as Longo, a Nilo-Saharan language spoken in Eastern Africa. A little more complicated than the English pattern, partly because I haven't given you all the details of English, or for that matter, Longo. But property words, particularly the most prototypical ones, have special singular and plural forms, just like we saw with closed nouns. And they optionally may use a what they call an attributive particle. That's the ah here. And then the blue represents the singular and plural forms. When they're predicated, they don't need a copula. They can inflect in the normal way with the present tense inflection that you see here, but they require a copula at the past, so this extra word that we find in the sentence, I was bad. For action concepts, you have also optional, but a longer extra word with two morphemes, the attributed particle plus the relativizer. And it inflects, but it inflects for the categories you find with action predication, where you have a full range of inflections and tone changes that I will not describe in any detail here. Just take my word that it has a fuller range than with property predications. So once again, we can use the semantic map model. It's a little more complicated because those Longo singular plural property concept stems are used in predication as well. Longo subject agreement is used in property predication as well as action predication. The Longo attributive marker is used in property modification as well as action modification, although it's optional. In fact, for that and the attributives here, it's optional in both cases. Now let's turn to another language, Cantonese, another one that's complicated in interesting ways. Some modification constructions do not have any sort of extra word, then the modifier is in blue. However, when you add a intensifier like very, then you get a particle. In predication, standard grammars will tell you that this whole word means very, you saw it over here, but it can be used in context where you're simply predicating the property without expressing an intensification of that property. Now this get word is also used as one of the relativizers for action modification. There's the action word and there's that get. In predication, the action words can use a suffix and an aspect type suffix, such as this one here. I don't dare pronounce Cantonese tones. Now you can use that aspect marker on a property concept like ugly, but if you do that, it changes its meaning to a process, an action, becoming ugly. So that's why it's down here in the lower right, because the word is actually interpreted as a process, an action, rather than a state. Okay, so you can see that there are different constructions in these different languages. We've looked at their distributional variation in each language, English, Longo, and Cantonese. But thanks to the semantic map in the conceptual space, we can now compare them across languages. Oh, sorry, here's the Cantonese parts of speech distribution. So you can see the Cantonese ga can be used for some property modification and the ho can be used for property predication. Now I'll do the comparison. So we're going to start by looking at the things that I had in blue. This is called behavior by syntacticians. All of these are pretty much inflectional categories. So inflectional possibilities. So when you superimpose the inflectional possibilities from these three languages, we can see that the inflection is centered on the prototypes, property modification and action predication. Sometimes they get extended to property predication or sometimes to action modification, but they always include the prototype. And then the orange things, the extra morphemes, have the exact opposite pattern. If anything, so they can be extended, but they always occur by avoiding the prototype. So they occur in the non-prototypical categories. And then they can be extended to, like Cantonese and Lango, attributive markers to property modification. In the three languages we looked at, the copula form never gets extended to action predication. So these are the kind of cross-linguistic patterns that allow us to formulate universals about noun, verb, and adjective as comparative concepts. And I won't go into that in any more detail. I just want to point out that the important point is that grammatical variation, that is distributional variation within a language, and grammatical variation across languages are governed by the same universal structures and principles. So the structure is the structure of the conceptual space that was in black in the preceding slide, and the principles are the things in the ovals, the overt coding avoiding prototypes and inflection being centered on the prototypes. So the principle I just described just applies to distributional variation as we normally think of it, but it also applies to another kind of language internal variation, kind of richer version of distributional variation, which I will present to you after a brief but important digression, because I want to pull together at this point in my talk some of the general, very, very general principles that underlie this functional typological theory. That is, how semantics, information packaging, and morphosyntactic form interact. So there's three principles of construal. So again, for those of you who are interested in cognitive linguistics, this is construal or conceptualization as understood in that framework. And as I said, information packaging is construal for communication. So the three principles that characterize construal or conceptualization is that any concept can be construed or packaged or conceptualized in just about any way by a speaker. It was illustrated in this talk by this pattern here, where basically you can use any kind of information packaging for any kind of concept. The second principle is that the nature of reality leads some ways of construing concepts to be more common than others. I'll just say common. Its frequency is how it seems to be manifested in language. One might say it's that some ways are more natural than others. That was illustrated by these prototypes. We're most likely to refer to objects, predicate actions that those objects participate in, and use properties to elaborate the characterization of those referred to objects. And the last principle is that construals are constrained by conventions of the speech community. This is a whole other dimension of understanding language, the social conventional aspect of language. I'm not going to go into that in this talk, that maybe it will arise in the discussion, but it's been illustrated by these semantic maps. We look at a language like Longo, and the exact distribution of these constructions of Longo across these functions is peculiar to Longo, and it's a characteristic of the Longo language as it's used by the Longo speech community. Now, one thing is I've been focusing on the sort of functional principles that underlie the expression of grammatical form and its diversity across languages and even within languages. But we want to ask, why is there often a mismatch between form and function? I mean, you can't just predict form based on function. I hope that's clear from all the examples I've given you across languages. Well, there's two fundamental reasons for this that have to again to do with going sort of beyond grammar in the usual sense. The first is that speakers tend to be very creative about the functions to which they put utterances. That's principle number one. They can conceptualize what they want to communicate in the world in lots of different ways, and they can be creative about that, breaking linguistic conventions. But speakers tend to be quite conservative about the forms they employ for these functions. So once they've recruited a particular morphosyntactic form to express a function, say in a creative fashion, they tend to stick to that form for a long time, not adapting it to its function. And this is one of the fundamental ways in which we see these mismatches. People just do conform to convention when they speak much of the time. So now I'm going to probe a little bit on how speakers actually use language. And by doing so, I'm going to take a verbalization perspective on grammar, both within and again across languages. So this is another type of language internal variation. Most linguistic analysis starts from form and looks at meaning. So looking at semantic interpretation and many grammatical theories, looking at polysemy patterns, which is a very popular topic in cognitive linguistics, for example. But one can also start from meaning and look at what grammatical forms are used by speakers to verbalize that meaning. And verbalization is basically information packaging or construal. What words and constructions do speakers choose to express an experience they want to convey to their hearers? And the best way to analyze verbalization is experimentally, where you can control the experiences that are being conveyed. Three famous examples are the pear film, the frog story, which is inspired by the pear film, used a lot in language acquisition studies, and then the Bowerman-Pedersen spatial picture set. There's some references there to work that was done around those projects. I'm going to describe some of my own work going back to the texts that were collected for the pear film. So the pear film basically has a bunch of scenes that express experiences, that describe things that were experienced by the viewers of the film, which were UC Berkeley undergraduates, who were then just asked to describe it to an experimenter. So they had to verbalize what they saw, and they were all verbalizing the same thing that they saw. So that experimental design maximizes similarity of the communicative situation for the speaker. And that's really important, because now what we're doing is we're doing calibration of different distribution patterns. We're looking at distribution patterns across speakers of the same language, and we're calibrating them by the fact that they're all expressing or describing the same experience, scenes in the film. So when you look at the pattern that the speakers have, you see this is not a simple thing. Here are a few examples. The 1, 2, 3 before the comma refers to the speaker, and the 75, 65, and so on refers to the intonation unit of the transcription of that speaker's verbalization. So, and this is a scene, I categorize it as D5. You can see what the scene is about if you haven't seen the film already. And you'll see that every one of the descriptions of the same scene by these different speakers is different. And here's another slide showing you that, yes, it continues. For all the speakers who verbalized scene D5, they all did it in a different way. Now, this is a small corpus, but every verbalization, every scene is unique in the entire corpus. I looked at all the verbalizations of all the scenes. Now, you can break down those verbalizations, those utterances, into the component parts, lexical categories like nouns and verbs they chose, argument structure constructions, and so on. And you'll still see that variation is pervasive. Speakers always, across the speakers, they use different ways to express it. But the variation that speakers used is constrained in ways that are familiar to typologists. So I'm going to show you two examples here to end my talk. The first is the second mention of reference. So a referent gets introduced in discourse. I looked at that as well, but I won't show that here. What I was interested in was a simpler pattern, which is how do you describe that referent when they're referred to again after they're introduced. And you found that for the most part, there were two ways in which speakers in the pair stories corpus did this. And they used a possessive pronoun, as in the first example. He dumps all his pairs into the basket. Or they use a definite article, which is what you normally think of as the official grammar of English. He dumps the pairs into a basket. But a lot of people use the possessive. Here's the distribution. This is a second mention reference of various participants in the pair film: tree, goat, ladder, pears, bicycle, hat, and apron. And whether they use the definite, the possessive, or the other. So first you can see from the table that there's not that many zeros. There's a lot of variation. And the color saturation of the cells tells you how common they were used. And you'll see first that the referents that are more animate and less likely to be possessed by somebody are most likely to get the definite article. The referents that are less animate and more likely to be possessed are ones that are more likely to get the possessive, not surprisingly. Now, I don't have any arrows here for the ladder and the pairs. That's a little more subtle. The ladder is less likely to be owned by the pear picker. In our culture, we would assume that the pear picker is a hired person and somebody else owns the ladder. And so you see the Berkeley students less likely to use the possessive pronoun. On the other hand, the bicycle in the story is more likely to be owned by a cyclist. At least back in the 70s, people owned their bicycles. There wasn't much renting going on. So it's more likely to take the possessive pronoun, implying the relationship to the cyclist. So we can look at the frequency distribution of these various verbalizations, and you can see a gradual climb from more likely to use the definite on the left to more likely to use the possessive on the right in percentage terms. So these contexts of use can be thought of as a one-dimensional conceptual space about different ways in which, or different situations in which one might choose to express the second mention with a definite article or a possessive pronoun. So it's a distributional pattern within English, but distributional variation now across speakers for the same scene. But this is not an unfamiliar phenomenon to typologists. So there is evidence described in a paper by Kari Fraurud of the use of possessives in a case where in English we'd use the definite article, like this Yucatec example, describing how to build a house. And you search for the cross beams, and again, English uses the, but the Yucatecs use the possessive. Now, this is what's called associative anaphora. So the cross beams actually haven't been mentioned before, but they're evoked by the context of building a house and setting up these pillars. But in other languages like Udmurt in Northern Eurasia, you can see that a case where it is a true second mention. The old woman ordered the girl to heat the sauna. The girl gets the possessive marker. So again, we see, as we saw with parts of speech, as the distributional variation, the conditioning factors, essentially that kind of decline of possessibility governs both speaker variation and language verbalization in English, and also cross-linguistic variation in what gets conventionalized in languages like English, Maya, and Udmurt. Another example I'll give you is unintended human actions. So there are several actions in this pair film where something happened to a person. So a person was participant, but they didn't intentionally bring about the action. So this was expressed in three ways by the English speakers. One was that the subject was the human participant, as in the first case, and then he crashes into a rock. Or the subject is another participant, so then it's his bike hits into a rock, or the pears in another scene, the pears all spill on the ground instead of the boy spilling the pears on the ground. Or you can use a kind of impersonal construction in English. One of the few examples was an existential construction. And there's a stone in the way, so his bicycle falls over. So they're describing the same scene. There's a human participant, but the human participant isn't expressed. Instead, an impersonal construction, an existential construction is used. So again, we can look at the frequency of verbalizations, and it varies from the different scenes depending on what's happening. And undergoer subject, that's where the human is the subject and something else is the subject, is the second column, existentials, and then a few stray other constructions. So when the events are more likely to be under control of the human participant, then you're more likely to get the undergoer, the human person, as the subject. It's like they should have been responsible, and they're expected to be responsible for the event, and they lost control. Events that are less likely to be under control of the human participant get something else as a subject. So from the human's point of view, the human participant's point of view, it's just like an accident. But it's a scalar Klein here. We can see that again, looking at the different possible expressions from when you're getting an undergoer, the human undergoer as a subject, or you get some other participant as a subject, and then the existentials in the middle with the missing basket, and then some other constructions. Once again, we can think of this horizontal axis as a one-dimensional conceptual space of Kleins of a Klein of semantic or controllability or expected control of the human participant over the outcome of the event. Now, this is very familiar to typologists. This is a pattern that's talked about quite frequently, that in what is called active inactive systems of alignment. So in Caddo and the Caddoan language, originally spoken or still spoken in the central part of the United States, we have I ran into a tree, and very similar to some of those examples from the pair stories, using the object form, the form that we used for he grabbed me. So it's literally something like me ran into a tree. And this is particularly used for experiential constructions. So like I felt afraid in Yoruba, spoken in Nigeria, it's I felt afraid is literally fear fell on me, so the non-human subject. And sometimes you get impersonal constructions. So the German example for I shiver is it shivers me. So in other words, the choices that speakers of English make are the same kind of choices that get conventionalized across languages. And again, we see the same pattern within languages, even when you get down to the sort of like very fine-grained variation in verbalization by speakers that you find typologically. Now, looking at this verbalization perspective also gives you a very different view of single language analysis. This is that the mapping between form and meaning is actually a probability distribution of forms used to verbalize particular situation types in a conceptual space. So we can't just say, oh, here's a meaning and it's expressed by this construction in the language. We have to say, here's a particular scene, and here's the probability that an English speaker is going to use, say, the human subject undergoer construction, or the non-human participant subject construction, or an impersonal construction. Of course, these probability distributions overlap, as we saw in those graphs, and their mode, the mode of the distribution defines the prototype meaning for the form, assuming a unimodal distribution, which we observed in the patterns. The modes were at the opposite ends of those figures. Of course, that may not be the case, but in general, the probability distributions overlap, and that's why we see speakers possibly saying, verbalizing the same scene in different ways. Now, those probability distributions are inferred from verbalization frequencies in language use, and not just by the linguist, not just like me analyzing these pair stories. It's what we hear as speakers of English all around us. So those probability distributions can be observed by speakers, and that's the missing link. That's the connection, is that these speakers of English, of any individual language, infer patterns of variation, and these patterns of variation are found across languages, but they're also found within a language through variation and verbalization. So I will conclude by briefly summarizing what I've argued for here, which is the unity of analyzing single languages and language typology. So distributional variation in a single language and variation in verbalization in a single language are basically of the same type as cross-linguistic patterns of variation that typologists observe. And that's because cross-linguistic variation and distributional variation in a single language are manifestations of the same underlying explanatory factors that we asked about at the beginning of the talk. Things like concepts of control, alienability or possessibility, the animacy or empathy hierarchy, patterns of combinations of semantics and information packaging like object reference and action predication, and so on. Now, typology, little plug for typology here, it's actually the fastest and the most effective way to capture universals of language structure and variation, because it's the easiest way to find these patterns of variation. It's not easy, we got to do a lot of looking at different reference grammars, but it's actually at least as easy as the alternatives. And typology combined with single language analysis can help us explain, to the extent that we can explain it, why the structure of a language, any language, is the way it is. And thank you very much. And what I've talked about will be described in gory detail in this forthcoming book next year.
Thank you very much, Professor Croft, for this excellent presentation. Now we will start the discussion session with invited discussant Edith Moravitsky, Professor Emerita at the Department of Linguistics at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Thank you, Professor Edith, for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much, Miguel, for the invitation. I have technical problems. I do not know whether you can hear me. Can you hear me? Please do let me know whether you can hear me. Am I audible? Can anybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, Miguel, if I could ask you to show slides 12 to 19, because I am raising a question on slide 12, and this relates to the question of defining comparative concepts in terms of distribution. So I'd like to know what Bill has to say about this. So we need slides 12 through 19.
Slide 12.
We need 12 and then through 19. So let's start with 12. Yes.
So this
okay,
is
so here is
12.
my question. Yes, correct. So here is my question to Bill. Can I understand his framework, which is quite wonderful? It allows us to compare all languages in the world on a particular general basis. My question is, can languages also be compared on the basis of distributional properties? That is to say, in terms of a particular constituent standing another or being in a particular with another. So the answer by Bill in his writings and by Hasselmath is a no. Okay, can we go to slide 13? Okay, I think some distributional characteristics differ across languages, others are the same, and it depends on the languages that we are looking at and the particular distributional characteristics. So let's go to the next slide. So here is an example from a non-linguistic domain where the comparison is by a distributional factor, namely the context where animals live. So basis of comparison, living in water. There is a generalization that arises from this comparison. Most aquatic animals extract oxygen from water rather than getting it from breathing. And this is, of course, a good thing. The test of our comparative concept is always whether they result in generalizations. If we had chosen some other property like the number of teeth of animals or color, it would not result in any generalization. So let's go to the next slide. Here I'm giving linguistic examples of distributional concepts that we can compare languages based on. Like, for example, we look for BSO order. Now, we are lucky because this particular distributional property, verb before S, S before O, results in a generalization. If we had chosen something else, just looking at NPs at the end of sentences, it would not have resulted in any interesting generalization, and therefore it would have been a non-useful comparative concept. Another example that sort of works out in a distributional property, object verb agreement. Again, it gives us a generalization because object verb agreement implies the presence of subject verb agreement. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, a third example is infixes. Now, infixing is a distributional property of affixes. Yes, infixes inside the stem. And again, this is a lucky choice of a comparative concept because again, there is a generalization that results. All languages use infixes also have affixes, as it was stated by Greenberg. Okay, next slide. So my conclusion is that we can freely, that is to say, randomly choose comparative concepts, the way we want to choose them. The question is only, is the choice going to be useful or not? And usefulness means the choice of the comparative concept results in a generalization. Next slide. The purpose of language typological research is to identify distributional patterns across languages, as it has been recently. So yes, we are looking for universals, but universality is one of the distributional results. We are interested in any kind of distributional patterns as well. So therefore, in language typological research, a comparative concept is useful if it allows statements about cross-linguistic distributional patterns. Next slide, please. So when we apply a comparative concept to a language, we will always get some kind of an outcome. It may be that it does occur in the language, or it doesn't, or it occurs with a particular frequency, or it doesn't apply. But all of these results are contributions to our goal, which is to establish the distribution of categories in language. Okay, I think that's the end of this part. Do you want to show the next slide? I think that has to do with something. Yeah, okay. Well, all right, I might as well go ahead and talk about the other topic related to taking from Bill's talk, namely the relationship between single language grammars and cross-linguistic generalizations. So one question that can be asked, how similar are the two types of endeavors in their goals and in their means. And as far as I can see, they are both distributional studies, and the goal is always to find general patterns. A second question is something that they raised. Are cross-linguistic implications available to the language learner? I think some of them may be, because sometimes we have a language typological implication where a more complex structure implies the presence of a more simple one. So, for example, object relativization implies the presence of subject relativization in a language, and presumably the second one is simpler than the first. Or the presence of the trial number in a language implies the presence of the doer. So when these language typological implications have to do with complex versus simple, it is very plausible that in the language learners' mind, there are also hierarchies of simple versus complex. So the same hierarchies that we find in language typology may also be present in the mind of the language learner. Next slide, please. So the third question is, what about the grammar writer? Is it useful for us when we write a grammar to know about language typological patterns? And I think so, yes. And I see two different ways in which a knowledge of language typology can help the grammar writer. Well, suppose I'm constructing a grammar for a language and I found a particular construction, but I'm not sure whether I made a mistake or whether it's the right analysis. So let's say I found that that you can relativize an object. So the man that I saw yesterday. Well, all right. If I know that this kind of pattern occurs in other languages also, it sort of supports or confirms my guess that is maybe true for this language as well. I can't be sure, but it is an increased possibility. Now, in addition, if I learn that this pattern is not just possible, but probable across languages, that will give me additional support for my analysis of that language. And of course, if I find out that that this pattern that I'm positing for my language is part of a universal, then of course that means that very great likelihood my analysis of that structure was correct. So let's say if it had been relativizing on subjects, then came, and I'm not sure whether I did it right. Well, if I learned that in languages, relativization of objects also implies relativization of subjects, and in my language, I do find relativization of objects, that renders the possibility of relativizing one subject actually necessary. So these are the three ways in which, as far as I can see, a knowledge of language typological patterns can support the endeavor of writing a grammar for a language. Okay, Bill, do you agree with both of these 2 points that I made about distributional analysis and the second one about the relationship between cross-linguistic patterns and the language learners endeavor and the grammar writers endeavor? So here is the conclusion, yeah. So, sorry, I'll go back, yeah. So both single language grammars and distributional analysis is being a generalization, and cross-linguistic patterns may be relevant for language learning and for grammar writing. Okay.
Shall I offer some comments? First, I want to say thank you very much to Edith for agreeing to be a commentator and discuss with me the talk, my talk and your comments before today. It's somewhat fortunate because since you're having technical difficulties, I couldn't hear much of what you said, though of course we've talked about it and there are slides that you showed. So I'm going to try to respond to most of the points. And I will also go share some slides, including a couple slides I didn't show. I want to say that I actually agree with a lot of what Edith has said. I think the point that, for instance, that comparative concepts, we can choose as typologists, we can look for any comparative concept we want, but we have to find good ones. One point that I've made in response to some statements by Martin Hasselmatt is that the selection of a comparative concept is not something that a typologist does first and then looks for something in a language. People look at languages, look at grammatical descriptions of languages, and then patterns emerge. So like the pattern of object reference and action predication and its relationship to the use of additional morphemes or use of particular inflections. That's something that I've observed. I mean, obviously I'm not the first, and many people have observed this for many decades. But that's what people who look across languages look at first. And then it's the attempt to formulate these generalizations that you see that require you to think about, well, what's the best way to create comparative concepts that will capture the generalization that I see in the data? It's something that really emerges from looking at data. It doesn't something like you start with a pile of comparative concepts and then look at a bunch of languages and see if there's a pattern there. You look at the languages first, and then it's a matter of, definitional. They're trying to create the right definitions that don't get caught in, some kind of erroneous categorization. And then the notion of distribution. So Edith and I talked about this a little bit on email. I'll try to articulate my perspective. I hope, Edith, you'll have a chance. Your technology will allow you to, add a response to your perspective. So in terms of cross-linguistic distribution, that's one sense of it, and I totally agree with what Edith says. We're looking at patterns of variation across languages, and that can be thought of as the distribution of constructions, particular constructions or particular strategies found in different languages. And then within languages, though, the issue that Martin and I both discussed in me and Radical Construction Grammar, and Martin in his 2010 paper in language and his follow-on papers, and I've had follow-on papers. There is a very specific notion of distribution going back to structuralism, American structuralism, distributional analysis. I mean, it's there in traditional grammatical analysis as well, which is looking at the occurrence, say, of particular words in English, in particular constructions of English, regardless of what they mean. Of course, as I said in my talk, that presupposes identifying constructions. So semantics does kind of, or function just sneak in the back door there. So you can have the English words that concur with the subject tense agreement markers. They aren't all dynamic processes. Words like, love, and hate, they take the inflection, but they're stated. And you can refine your definition of the semantics, but you're never going to get a perfect match. So that's kind of what I mean. And the big issue that I have, and I'm speaking for myself now, Martin Hasselmatt, he has his own reasons, but when in Radical Construction Grammar, my book from 2001, the problem I have with people talking about, say, adjectives and verbs across languages is that they weren't really comparing like with like. So one language, you take a property concept and predication and say, oh, it uses that construction. So this language, and that construction is used for action concepts. So this language doesn't have adjectives. And then somebody else looks at another language and says, oh, and add a property concept and modification, it agrees in gender and number with the noun. Well, that's a totally different construction than the person who looked at the first language with, with the whatever the predication construction is, subject agreement or whatever. And so that's not comparing like with like. I'm fine with comparing all the different ways that languages predicate property concepts. That's what Leon Stassen did. It's part of this magnum opus on intransitive predication. And I'm fine with people who compare how property concepts are used as modifiers, whether they have a gender agreement and number agreement, or whether they have some kind of attributed particle or whatever. But those are two different, there they are comparing like with like. And then you can look at the two together. That's what I did. And then then these patterns emerge. But there is the real problem of people using different constructions to define the categories. But then the other thing, a point that I mentioned that I sort of elaborated on, something that came out of my discussions with Edith, so I definitely thank her for forcing me to bring this out, is that even when you're comparing, distributional patterns within distributional categories in one language to that distributional categories in the other language, you still have to calibrate them by looking at their meaning. So, we compare words in English to words in Chinese, but we have to make sure these words are translation equivalents. And then we can do that, then we can succeed in that comparison. So I do think that it goes beyond traditional structuralist distributional analysis, which focuses just on form, a word form occurring in a particular position in a string of words, the construction or the discourse context in a American structuralist sense. We have to look at meaning too. And as I said before, that's the missing link or the pivot that allows us to look at what's happening within a language and across languages. So that's like a very lengthy answer or clarification to Edith's first set of comments. And now I want to turn to I think I may be covering the first two, but now I want to turn to the last one. So tell me, Edith, if I've missed something. But for your last comment, I would still say that, cross-linguistic generalizations, patterns of variation can be observed in a language, for instance, as you said, with different kinds of relative clause constructions, where you have differences in the constructions or similarities in constructions that will conform to cross-linguistic universals. But I do think it's these underlying patterns that are the relevant thing, not the kind of implicational, implication universal is a description of a pattern across languages, but they're, linguist typologists propose explanations for them, like the animacy hierarchy or the noun phrase accessibility hierarchy of Keenan and Comrie for relative clauses, or the kind of the semantics, the space, the conceptual space I have for parts of speech with the prototypes. Those are the underlying patterns that I think are part of what a speaker of a language either knows or brings to the language acquisition process, or it's something that emerges from the language acquisition process, not just interacting with people in the world, but also interacting linguistically with the people that they are learning the language from. So, sometimes the kind of cross-linguistic generalization could be manifested if their internal variation is just right, especially if you start looking at probabilistic patterns. Then you get a lot more variation as you realize is visible to a speaker or audible to a speaker. But then there might be others where it's not so obvious. I mean, just looking at the linguistic behavior, but the speaker still has, this empathy or understanding of animacy, for example, which is, it's partly independent of your linguistic skills or, your linguistic knowledge. It's part of the way you interact with people and animals and things in the world. So I don't say it has to be there in the linguistic, the linguistic language, but the language that the speaker hears around them. But it's, more of it's there than most people think. When you take a verbalization perspective, there's more, but there could still be things that emerge from, just being in the world. Could even be some kind of innate endowment. don't have any strong feelings about that.
I could say a few words to this, but since the audio system is so bad, I think it's best if I refrain from trying to talk too much. Just the first point that Bill mentioned, having a definition of your comparative concept. As he pointed out, it's terrible when people say, I'm comparing subject in one language with subject in another language, and they use different criteria for defining subject. So it is indeed very important to use the same criteria. In my mind, you can define your comparative concept in any way, and then your findings will always be relative to your definition. So the definitions will always have to be provided when you are communicating your results, because there will be the relationship between the two. Okay. That's it.
Well, thanks very much, Edith. I'm really sorry that the technical difficulties prevent you from articulating your thoughts. I do want to just mention now to the audience that one of my inspirations for this radical constructional approach is a paper that Edith wrote a long time ago in 1978 about ergative and accusative patterns, showing that they were dependent on the constructions you used for defining the ergative or accusative categories. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much. I'm really honored to have been invited to comment on this talk, and it's been a very important intellectual process for me to think about these concepts.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Croft and Professor Moraves, for your collaboration with the series Abralinha ao Vivo. I'd like to take this opportunity to invite everyone to continue watching our live lectures. Professor Croft, would you like to say something before we end the transmission?
I'd just like to first, of course, thank Abralinha for putting on this great series. It's been really a wonderful opportunity for people around the world to have the chance to hear linguists talk about various topics when we were all constrained by the pandemic, but also for people around the world who can't travel to conferences like many of us do, to hear what people are saying at the conferences. That's a benefit of the world that we live in now, the constraints that the pandemic has imposed on us. I hope it's leveled the playing field so that many people who don't have the opportunity to go to conferences in Europe and Asia and North America will be able to hear about different strands of linguistics that they may not have a direct experience of in their home country, or may not have access to some of the materials, some of the writings that we based our work on.
Thank you, Professor Croft. So once again, thanks everyone. Until next time.
Thank you very much.